start on a summer afternoon in the 1960s, in a small town tucked into the far northwest corner of Montana. There is a ball field near the middle of town, two diamonds laid out on flat ground beside a low industrial building the locals called the expansion plant. The company that owned the plant had paid for the field. Little League games ran there all summer long, and along the edge of the outfield, where the plant stored and shipped its product, there were piles of ore, loose and light and gray, heaped up like snowdrifts. When the games ended, the children climbed into them. They jumped off the storage bins into the soft piles below. They buried each other up to the neck. The ore was warm and feathery, and it drifted in the air when you kicked it, and nobody told the children to stop because nobody in Libby knew there was any reason to. That ore was vermiculite. Heated, it puffed up into the light, fireproof flakes that went into attic insulation all across America, and it was laced, all of it, with a form of asbestos called tremolite, needle-shaped fibers so fine that a single breath could carry thousands of them deep into a lung, where they would stay for the rest of a person's life. This is not the story of a place that vanished. It is the story of what one company did to the people who worked for it and the families who breathed its dust, and of a single year in which that company had every reason to stop and chose instead to keep going. It is also the story of the clinic built to care for the people who survived, and of what is happening to it right now. Here is what the company held in its own files by the end of 1969. A letter from its own insurer, in writing, saying that sick workers had to be told, and that failing to tell them broke federal law. A memo of its own, weighing the money it stood to lose against the health of men it already knew it was harming. And a stack of chest x-rays showing that 92% of the men who had worked the mine for 20 years or more had damaged lungs. It had all of that in 1 year. It said nothing, and it kept mining for 21 more. But the year the company stayed silent only matters if you understand what was there before it and who was breathing the air while the files quietly filled up. Libby sits in Lincoln County, in the last stretch of Montana before the Idaho line, on the Kootenai River under the Cabinet Mountains. The town that grew there was a timber town. A Minnesota firm moved its lumber operation to Libby in 1911, and for the next half-century, wood was the reason the town existed. The summer festival was Logger Days. The high school teams were, and still are, the Libby Loggers. The mine was the other thing, the good, quiet, well-paid other thing. What the mine produced was vermiculite. Heated, the ore expands to many times its own volume into a light, absorbent flake that will not burn, which made it close to a perfect building material. It went into the walls and attics of houses all over the country, by some estimates as many as 35 million American homes. And running all through the deposit, inseparable from the good ore, was the tremolite. Commercially worthless, geologically unavoidable, and among the most persistent things a human lung can ever encounter. Every ton that came off that mountain carried it, and everyone who mined it, milled it, or lived downwind of it breathed it. The work was dusty beyond description, and the men came home gray with it. The town did not know what the dust was. The company did, and so did the state. In 1956, an industrial hygienist for the Montana State Board of Health named Ben Wake went into the plant and took air samples. His report used careful, technical language. The asbestos dust in the air, he wrote, is of considerable toxicity. He would come back and confirm his findings a few years later. That report went to the company, and it went to the state. It did not go to the men breathing the dust. 3 years after that, in 1959, the first Libby worker was formally diagnosed with asbestosis, the slow scarring of the lungs that asbestos causes. That same year, the company ran chest x-rays on its own workforce. Of 130 men examined, 48 came back with abnormal lungs, nearly 4 in 10. The men were not told. In 1963, a much larger company bought the whole operation, and it bought the files right along with it. The company was W.R. Grace, a chemical conglomerate out of the East, and when it took over the Libby mine, it took over everything the mine's records already showed. Grace employed only about 130 people in Libby at any one time, in a town of roughly 2,600. But those were union jobs, and they paid well, and the company was generous in the way that companies can be when generosity is cheap. It gave to the hospital fund. It paid for the Little League field. As one woman from Libby later put it, every kid from that town played on that field. The generosity ran further than the ball diamonds. The company gave the raw ore away. Residents were told they could come and haul the tailings off by the truckload for free, and they did. And they spread it on their driveways and their gardens and worked it into the soil of their vegetable beds. The high school surfaced its running track with it. There was an ice rink laid out over it. The stuff was in the flower beds and along the base paths, and it was, all of it, the very same ore the children were burying themselves in beside the expansion plant downtown. For context, by the end of the 1960s, the mill on the mountain was putting something on the order of 24,000 pounds of dust into the air every single day, and of that, roughly 5,000 pounds a day was asbestos. Inside the dry mill, the air itself ran as high as 40% asbestos. This was not a trace contaminant that slipped through. This was the working condition. By the end of that decade, the men in Grace's offices were no longer guessing about what the dust was doing. They were reading it, in 2 documents that arrived in the very same year. In 1969, the company's insurance carrier wrote to Grace about the men whose x-rays were getting worse. When an x-ray picture shows a change for the worse, the letter said, that person must be told, and that person must be gotten out of the environment. Failure to do so, it went on, is not humane and is in direct violation of federal law. That was the insurer. The company's own insurer, telling it in writing that keeping quiet was against the law. That same year, inside the company, someone wrote a memo of their own. Our recent experience at Libby, it read, may well create for us a significant financial liability. And then, in the same breath, the harder sentence. We also should be concerned with the obligation to our employees, namely, permitting them to perform their services under working conditions which we have good reason to believe are hazardous. Good reason to believe are hazardous. That is the company describing its own mine in its own words in 1969. And behind both of those documents was the medical record the company was keeping and not sharing. At one point, the x-rays showed that 92% of the men who had worked the mine for 20 years or more had abnormal lungs. 9 out of every 10 of its most loyal, longest-serving workers, their chests already scarring over. The company had the insurer's warning, its own memo, and its own x-rays, all in the same 12 months. It told no one. It kept the mine open for 21 more years. The records were now in the files. The question that would take 30 years to answer was whether any of it would ever matter in a courtroom. What came after was not hesitation. It was management. In 1976, the company paid a researcher at a university in New Jersey to run a toxicology study, feeding Libby tremolite to laboratory animals. The contract included a clause forbidding him from publishing the results without the company's permission. The animals developed progressive asbestos disease in their lungs. The study stayed quiet. It was not until 1979, a full decade after the insurer's letter, that Grace formally told its workers that the tremolite in the ore might be a hazard to their health. 10 years. In that decade, the men kept sweeping the dry mill and kept driving home in dust-caked clothes and kept handing those clothes to their wives to wash. In 1982, one of the company's own industrial hygienists circulated a mortality study of the Libby workforce to senior management. Our major problem, he wrote, is death from respiratory cancer. This is no surprise. No surprise. The men were dying in exactly the pattern the files had predicted, and the phrase the company reached for internally was that none of it came as a surprise. There was, by then, a doctor who could see the pattern from the outside. Across the state line in Spokane, a pulmonologist named Allan began noticing something in the lungs of patients who had come from Libby. The disease he was seeing did not behave the way ordinary asbestosis behaved. It kept advancing after exposure stopped. It scarred the lining around the lungs and slowly tightened it, like a rind closing over the breath, and it did this in workers, and then in their wives, and then in people who had never gone near the mine at all. He would eventually treat hundreds of them. The mine closed in 1990, worked out and no longer worth running. Grace packed up its Libby operation and left the town quietly over the next few years. By then, the mountain had given up nearly its whole seam, and the ore was in the attics and the gardens and the lungs, and the men who had worked it were beginning, in real numbers, to die. The person who would not let the town's dead stay quiet was a meter reader named Gayla Benefield. Her father Pearlie had worked at the mine, and he died in 1974. Her mother died in 1996, of the same disease, having never worked a single day at the mine in her life. Benefield went looking for a reason, and she went to the courthouse, and she started reading. She read the death records and the medical files and the lawsuits, and she slowly understood that her parents were not 2 isolated tragedies. They were 2 entries in a very long list. The town did not thank her for it. Libby was a company town down in its bones, and the company had been the good employer. And here was a woman insisting that the good employer had been killing people for decades. She said later that she strolled into the state capitol and did not stop until people pretty much hated her, that she may have been the single least liked person in all of Libby. for a while, the town's answer to her came printed on bumper stickers. Yes, I'm from Libby, Montana, and no, I don't have asbestosis. In a Lincoln County courtroom in 1997, a jury found against W.R. Grace, one of the first public verdicts the company ever lost to one of its own workers. The man who had brought the case was named Les Skramstad. He had worked at the mine for about 2.5 years around 1960, sweeping out the dry mill, breathing the worst of it, and in 1996, he was diagnosed with asbestosis. But the part of his story that stays with people is not the verdict. His wife, Narita, had never worked at the mine either. She was diagnosed with asbestosis from breathing the dust that came home in his work clothes, from shaking them out and washing them, year after year, in their own house. Les Skramstad died on the 21st of January 2007 of the disease he had spent his last years forcing the country to look at. He died before the criminal trial he had fought for ever opened. He had carried the poison home in his own laundry. By then, America had already half heard this company's name. In 1998, the film Uncivil Action had put John Travolta on screen fighting a corporate water poisoning case in Woburn, Massachusetts, and one of the real defendants behind that case had been W.R. Grace. The far larger story was still sitting in a courthouse in Montana, and it broke in November of 1999. An investigative reporter named Andrew Schneider at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published a series on Libby. The headline answered the movie almost directly. Uncivil Action, it read. A town left to die. Schneider reported that at least 192 people were already dead, and 375 more had been diagnosed, and the records that proved it had been sitting in the courthouse the entire time. It took a reporter from another state to walk in and read them out loud. The federal response was fast once it finally came. 3 days after the articles ran, the Environmental Protection Agency sent an emergency on-scene coordinator to Libby. He found a town where the contamination was not confined to the mine. It was in the schools, the gardens, the running track, the attics, the driveways, the ball fields. The cleanup that began then would run for the better part of 2 decades. And by then, the poison had reached even the work the town was founded on. For all the attention that fell on the mine, timber, not vermiculite, had always been Libby's largest employer. In 2002, the Stimson Mill, the last sawmill in town, closed its gates, and 200 people were laid off. Reporting at the time noted that the asbestos crisis and the insurance costs it dragged behind it had played a part in the closing. The mine's dust had helped carry off the timber jobs too. Then came the question of who would answer for it. The short version is almost no one. In 2001, facing a mountain of asbestos injury claims that would eventually number somewhere around 129,000, W.R. Grace filed for bankruptcy. It would stay there for 13 years, and bankruptcy did something very specific. It took the flood of individual lawsuits, each one a sick person or a dead one, and funneled them all into a single controlled process with a ceiling on it, which is one of the things bankruptcy is designed to do. In 2002, Libby was added to the federal Superfund list of the most contaminated places in the country. And in 2005, a federal grand jury handed up something genuinely unusual. It indicted the company itself, W.R. Grace, along with 7 of its former executives on criminal charges: knowing endangerment, conspiracy, obstruction. It was described at the time as the largest environmental crimes prosecution in the country's history. For once, it looked as though the people who had run the company, and not merely the corporate shell, would stand in front of a jury. The trial opened in Missoula in the spring of 2009, in the courtroom of a federal judge named Donald Malloy. It did not go the way the size of the case suggested it might. The government's own case had problems. Its star witness was a former Grace executive whose credibility the judge told the jury to treat with great skepticism, over a relationship with the prosecutors that had not been disclosed. At another point, the judge described the government's failure to hand over required evidence as an inexcusable dereliction of duty. Before the trial was through, the charges against 2 of the executives were dismissed. And in May of 2009, after less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury acquitted the company and the remaining executives on every single count. No one was ever criminally convicted for what happened in Libby. The documents from 1969 were not missing from that trial. The insurer's letter was in evidence. The memo was in evidence. The x-rays were in evidence. The jury read all of it, and it took less than 2 days to come back with not guilty on every count. 5 weeks later, something happened that had never happened before. On the 17th of June, 2009, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency declared a public health emergency in Libby and the neighboring town of Troy, the first the agency had ever declared under the federal Superfund law. It unlocked federal money to pay for medical care for the sick. It was, and it remains, the only distinction of its kind the town ever received. And it arrived 5 weeks after a jury found that no one was to blame. Grace came out of bankruptcy in 2014. The settlement funded a set of trusts, with more than $4 billion in them, to pay asbestos claims, including a separate trust just for homeowners who needed the zonalite insulation pulled back out of their attics. The company survived. It restructured, and it kept trading. There was one more place people went looking for accountability. The railroad that runs through the middle of Libby, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, had loaded vermiculite at its downtown yard for decades, and that yard had shed dust into the town the whole time. In 2024, a federal jury in Helena found the railroad liable in the deaths of 2 people who had never worked at the mine, and awarded $8 million, $4 million for each of them. In February of 2026, a federal appeals court overturned the verdict. The railroad, the court found, had been legally obligated to haul the ore, and could not be held strictly liable for carrying freight the law required it to carry. Another door closed. Les Skramstad had been dead for 2 years by the time the jury acquitted the company. Now set the damage against the accountability. On the damage side, the counting is still not finished, and the estimates are grim and imprecise in the way that makes them worse rather than better. Documented estimates of the dead range from more than 400 people to nearly 700. Something on the order of 2,400 people have been diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease traceable to the mine. By the local clinic's own reckoning, at least 1 in 10 people currently living in Libby has one. The cleanup took the town apart to get the poison out of it. Crews inspected on the order of 8,100 properties and cleaned more than 2,600 of them. They hauled away more than 1 million cubic yards of contaminated soil. The federal government spent in excess of $600 million. For context, this was not a spill in a river or a plume of chemicals under a single factory floor. It was a whole town's yards and attics and school grounds, dug up and carried off by the truckload, the same way the ore had once been carried in. Libby itself is not going anywhere. More than 3,000 people live there now, and the number has been rising. The cleaned neighborhoods have been declared safe and handed back. People come now for the falls on the Kootenai River and the mountains standing over the town. Libby is doing the slow work of being a place with a future, and not only a past. Through all of it, the sick were looked after by one small institution. The town's asbestos clinic, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease, opened at the start of the 2000s under a doctor named Brad Black, who has run it and screened the town's lungs for 25 years. Its screening work produced well over 100 scientific papers on what the Libby ore does to a human body. It is the place a person in Libby goes when they can no longer draw a full breath. The clinic's last years were not quiet ones. The same railroad that had shed vermiculite dust across its downtown yard for decades, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, turned on the clinic itself. It sued the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease under the Federal False Claims Act, arguing that the clinic had certified people as sick who did not qualify for the federal program that paid for their care. In the summer of 2023, a federal jury sided with the railroad in part, finding more than 300 of the clinic's claims false and returning a judgment of roughly $6 million against it. The clinic filed for bankruptcy that August, a case that was later resolved after the Justice Department intervened on its side. But the judgment did not go away. In May of 2025, a county sheriff arrived with a writ of execution for more than $3 million on the railroad's behalf, seized the clinic's building outright, and forced its doors shut. The place that had spent a quarter of a century reading the town's lungs was locked out of the very rooms it worked in. It found a new address a few streets away and reopened there, kept alive on a federal health grant. That grant was the thread it was hanging by. This August, that clinic closes its patient services. The federal health agency that had been funding it declined to renew the grant, and the organization is dissolving. The town that received the only public health emergency of its kind in the country's history is losing the very clinic built to care for the people that emergency was declared for. And people in Libby are still being diagnosed. The disease can take decades to surface, which means the mine is still producing patients more than 30 years after it stopped running. But the mine is another matter. The mountain the ore came from, 10,000 acres of it, has never been cleaned. A plan for what to do with it is expected in 2027. Until then, the road up to it stays closed, and the ground has not stopped moving. In December of 2025, A flood tore out an embankment along Libby Creek that still held asbestos, and through the spring that followed, investigators were still tracing where the loosened fibers had gone. The mountain is not finished with the valley below it. Drive north out of Libby and turn up Highway 37, and after a few miles you reach the turn for Rainy Creek Road, the road that runs the 7 miles up to the mine. There is a gate across it. Beyond the gate, the road climbs to the worked-out mountain, where the tremolite is still in the ground, still exactly where it always was, waiting on a cleanup plan that has not yet been written. The company had its insurer's warning, its own memo, and its own x-rays, all in 1969. It read all three, and it kept the mine open for 21 more years, and no jury ever held it to account for the choice. Hundreds of people are dead. The company paid into a trust and went on trading. That is the whole distance between what was done and what was ever answered for. The mountain is still there. The gate on the road is still there. The insulation is still in the attics, in millions of houses, in towns that have never once heard the name Libby. And in the middle of Libby, the ground where the expansion plant stood has been cleaned and cleared. And the ball fields the company paid for are still there too. Children still play on them. They just don't climb into the piles anymore. There are no piles anymore. It took hundreds of deaths and $600 million and the only emergency of its kind in the country to carry them away. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.